Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm Robin Eisler, team mom and founder here at Booster Hub. We're excited to bring this webinar to you tonight about organizational best practices and how you can keep your booster club on track. Tonight we have Drew Englund, Chief Operations Officer at ParentBoosterUSA. We're excited to have you join us, Drew. We'll go ahead and get started. Drew, first of all, I'd love for you to take a minute and talk about Parent Booster USA and your role there.
Yes, absolutely. And it's good to be here. ParentBooster USA is a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to help educate on the compliance rules required to run a school booster club, violating as few laws as possible, ideally zero, is what we strive for. And we help school booster clubs get tax exemption, maintain tax exemption, comply with state rules, as well as answer a wide variety of general questions about best practices for school booster clubs.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. I know here at Booster Hub, we welcome working with your team whenever we have clubs that have questions about the intricacies of some of the IRS and tax laws related to these nonprofits. If you're not familiar with Booster Hub, we're a software application that provides tools and infrastructure to run your booster club. So we handle things like contact management, emails, help run your concession stand, do websites, online stores, and then also have integrated accounting in our system. So tonight we're going to go over a few things to give you some tips on how to keep your club on track. The topics we're going to cover this evening include budgets and the budgeting process. Since we have Drew's expertise tonight, we're going to focus on the 501c3 organizations and some tips and tools on that. We'll cover sales tax, which I think is a stumbling block that a lot of booster clubs run into. A lot of clubs think that they are exempt from sales tax, and that is not the case. And so Drew's going to give us some insight into how to be aware of that, how to set it up, and go deeper into that topic. And then we'll talk about some financial controls and some of the ways that you can make sure your club's protected from fraud and theft. And then just move into some tips and tricks on all these topics to give you some tangible things to take back to your club and apply. If you have any questions, we do have a Q&A button. It should be on your screen. You can submit the questions, and we will be answering those questions at the end of the webinar. And we do anticipate the webinar running about 45 minutes, just for time purposes. So we'll move on. The first topic here tonight, we're going to talk about budgets, why you should use them, how they should be structured, and really the process of creating budgets. I see a lot of booster clubs. We work with hundreds of booster clubs, and I see a lot of clubs that don't use any budgets. And the problem with that is that really the budgets are your first line of financial control. It's what your board and your members have agreed to spend and the amount you've attempted to fundraise for the year. And they really provide visibility into what those numbers are. And so at the end of the year, it's a great benchmark to see did your income and expenses match those, not only for the goals and purposes of your organization, but also to make sure that your expenses, for example, did not grossly exceed what you had planned them to be, which is one of the ways that you can protect against fraud and theft. Another really important reason to use a budget and go through the process is for planning for your club and to determine, how much do you need to fundraise. And so when you go through the budgeting process, there's a couple different ways to do it. What we see a lot of clubs do is they do what they did last year. So that's the easy way to do it, to see what they've done in years before and see if that works again for this year. But there are some different ways to go about it. So you can certainly look at it, the historical perspective. You can take a look at, what your needs are and what you need to accomplish. If you've got new needs, or perhaps in some cases you'll have less needs than you've had before. And then you can Also, set some goals. So when I was the president of a booster club, the president that came in after me had some really good ideas about upgrading our equipment that for years I had never seen the need to do till somebody pointed it out to me. So part of the budgeting process can be to go through and evaluate the needs of your club and then determine what you need to fundraise, to get to those objectives that you're setting. The other really nice part about creating a budget is it's motivating. So, sometimes people come to us and say, well, our booster clubs, we always do $1,000 a year. And perhaps, just make that number $2,000 a year. And then you've got a goal set and, you can take tangible steps to reach that goal. So it can work as a motivational tool for your booster club as well. When you're structuring your budget, really the way most people look at their budgets in a booster club is going to be on an annual basis, and looking at budget and then budget versus actual, and then you can see whether or not you're ahead or behind budget. So that's a really good structure because that keeps you on track. You've got a way to see if you're tracking in the right direction depending on whether or not it's income or expenses. We also recommend creating sub-budgets for your events or certain time periods. So this is really important if your booster club does most of your income in 1 or 2 months out of the year, and then has most of your expenses in 1 or 2 months out of the year. Your annual budget can be a bit deceiving if you only look at the budget on an annual basis. So a lot of our fall clubs, for example, do most of their fundraising in August. And so you may want to create a budget just for August, just to look at how you're tracking during that month against the objectives that you've set, which may be hard to see if you're just looking at an annual budget. So definitely recommending breaking down those budgets into the smaller events and time periods. When you're creating the budget, you really want to be interactive in the process and involve all the stakeholders. So you're going to want to involve your booster club members, your coaches or directors, perhaps even your students. And this kind of leans to what I was talking about a few minutes ago. I had been running our club for 3 years. We had been doing everything we had been doing the year before, but it wasn't until someone new came along and said, hey, I think there's some things here that could be updated or improved. So it's really important to, put a call out to everyone, say, hey, we're getting ready to start our budgeting cycle. And do you have any suggestions for things we could be doing differently? And that also involves saving on expenses. There may be some things that if you're really considering it for budget purposes, you could get some feedback that could really help there. And then as part of that process, we recommend taking the budget through an approval cycle so that you do a draft budget. It gets circulated perhaps at one booster club meeting, and then you get your updates and your edits, and then that budget is then approved at the next meeting. And so that should be the documented approved budget for the organization. And that does a couple things. It's going to, one, document those figures, again, back to the financial control. It's going to give you some framework as to what the numbers should be that you should be working in. And then it's also going to give you some guidance for, how to run your year, how to get things going, what you need to plan for and that type of thing. And then we suggest that anytime you make an edit to that budget, it actually becomes a new budget and it becomes the amended budget. So that way, anytime a number's been changed or updated on the budget, there's a record of it. And again, that's an important financial control. Drew, did you have anything to add on the budget side?
Really, the main thing I want to add with budgets is that, in my experience, the main reluctance with budgets is people feeling like it traps them to whatever it is they budget for at the beginning of the year. And while, yeah, it would be a good idea to try and stick close to your budget, at the end of the day, the budget is really just a tool to try and guide you on what money you should be spending, what money you should be raising. And if you need to amend the budget, that's usually a very simple process. And if it's not a very simple process, you should probably change whatever is making it complicated, because it should be as simple as having a meeting and voting on it.
Absolutely, good point. And that's when I was talking about approval, that's also the point of the budget is that that is what the board has agreed to spend, so it can help you in your approval process, and that should be relatively easy. As you mentioned, in a board meeting everybody votes, and now you've got an amendment to the budget if you do need to change those figures. Right. We're going to jump into the 501c3 section, and Drew, we'll turn it over to you for this part.
Sure. So let's start with what 501c3 is, other than a seemingly arbitrary string of numbers and letters that you really want. 501c is essentially just a list. There's a different section of the IRS tax code that says certain organizations are exempt from federal income tax, and that those organizations are listed in IRS section 501c. So 3 is the third item on that list of tax-exempt organizations. And so you get 501 subsection C number 3. 501c3 organizations are charitable, religious, educational, scientific, literary, testing for public safety, or amateur sports related. And there are a handful of other options. The list goes on, but most booster clubs content themselves with simply being charitable organizations, which gets you there no problem. There are two big advantages to 501c3. The first is you are tax exempt. It means you do not have to pay federal income tax. And it is important to know that 501c3 is for federal income tax. If you have a state income tax, and if you're a corporation, a state corporate income tax, 501c3 may help you, but it is not all you need. 501c3 is exempted from federal income tax. It means that you do not have to pay tax on the money that your organization brings into the federal government. If you do not have some form of federal tax exemption, and again, 501c is a list, but you're going to want to have it be 501c3 if you can. If you don't have some form of federal tax exemption, you have to pay federal income tax, because either you are tax exempt or you aren't. And if you aren't, that means you pay tax. The second reason why 501c3 in particular is just the best option on that list of 26 or 27 different ways to get to federal tax exemption is it means donations to your organization are tax deductible. That means if I donate $20 to your booster club, when it comes time for me to send in my taxes for the year, I can itemize if I want, and I can take that $20 I donated as a charitable donation deduction on my personal income taxes. This is a really big advantage for donors. A lot of individual donors may or may not itemize. It may or may not matter there, but it's nice to have. And if you want donations from any kind of corporate entity, whether it is a local restaurant who wants to sponsor you, or a major national grant giving program like Walmart or Disney or Target or Amazon, they are all going to want that 501c3 because I'm sorry to break it to you, they are not in this out of the goodness of their own heart. They are after A, the PR, but B, the tax deduction. And they can only get that tax deduction if they're giving money to a 501c3. So you want to be a 501c3. So that's why you want it. Do you need it? If you are willing to pay federal income tax, I guess good on you. But if you'd like to avoid that, yes, you need some form of tax exemption, and 501c3 is just the best. And if you are a booster club, you can probably get 501c3, so why not? So what are the requirements of it? You have to be in that one of the options in that long list of different organizations that qualify for 501c3. Booster clubs usually go for charitable. They can sometimes make an argument for educational, given how closely related they are to schools. But really, most of them just call themselves charitable organizations because they're raising money to help school activities, and that's a charitable cause. In order to actually apply for the steps, you need to either file an application with the IRS, and it's going to be form 1023 or 1023-EZ. Most of us just call it the 1023. If you're under, if you bring in under $50,000 a year, you can file the EZ version of the form. If you are over $50,000 in a year, you have to file the 1023. The 1023 EZ is appropriately named, a lot easier than the 1023. But either way, if you're not familiar with the tax code, you're probably going to want a little bit of help. Alternatively, you can join a group exempt organization. That's part of what Parent Booster USA does for school booster clubs. I believe the national PTA and many of the state-based PTAs have a form of group exemption that you can join. I believe Future Farmers of America has something like that. Group exemptions are basically the IRS has recognized that there is this central entity that qualifies for tax exemption, and all of its member organizations are also going to be tax exempt, basically because the central organization says so. There's a little bit more going on there. The central organization has an obligation to make sure that all of the people who join it and that it gives tax exemption are, in fact, in this case, booster clubs. But it really is fairly simple. But that's really how you get it. You either file a 1023 or you join a group exemption. In order to maintain your 501c3 status, you will have to file what's called a information return at the end of every year. It is basically a tax return, but we don't call it a tax return because no tax is going to be due, because again, you're tax exempt. And so it is an information return. It's due the 15th day of the 5th month after your fiscal year end, which, if that sounds like gibberish, I don't blame you. I just haven't found a better way to describe it. And that's how the IRS says it, is the 15th day of the 5th month after your fiscal year end. What that means is if your fiscal year ends in December, it's due May 15th, January, June 15th, and you can probably intuit out from there. But that is how that works. The 990 ranges from really simple, really simple. If you're under that $50,000 threshold, you file Form 990N, piece of cake, size of a postcard, you can do it. I believe in you. To the 990EZ, if you're between $50,001 and $200,000 in revenue every year, more complicated. Nobody will blame you if you want to get an accountant or some help with it. It gets into some details of your finances. You're going to want to be aware what's on that in order to comply. If you're over $200,000 in gross revenue a year, or you have over $500,000 in assets, congratulations, you need an accountant. Because you're going to be filing Form 990, and that is difficult. And that really is the core of it. You want to be 501c3 because that means donations to you are tax deductible and you're not paying federal income tax, and a lot of state income tax exemptions require it. And it's how you get the donations, and it's fairly easy to maintain, especially if you're under $50,000 a year.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew. One question just to clarify, because we see this sometimes. So if you're just a parent group that has come together and you're just raising funds on your own and you don't have a 501c3, you're at risk of those funds being income or being taxable. Is that correct?
I wouldn't even say that you're at risk. If you're bringing in money, you are either tax exempt or taxable. If you aren't tax exempt, you owe tax.
Right. Yeah, we see some organizations that just think they don't need a 501c3, and it is really important because it does give you that exemption from the income tax, but not the sales tax, right?
We'll get into that in a second, but yes, no, 501c3 does not get you sales tax.
That's the important one here that we want to focus on. Great. Well, thank you, Drew. We'll step on to the next subject here. So now we'll move into the sales
tax. Here we are, sales tax. Smooth transitions, I like it. So yes, sales tax is not income tax. These and other witty observations coming your way. Sales tax is a state-by-state tax. Some states have it, most states have it. On the sale of goods, you may or may not be required to collect it depending on your state. Some states just have this blanket exemption for nonprofit organizations. Some states have blanket exemptions for booster clubs. Some states have exemptions on nonprofit organizations buying things but not selling things. Some states have exemptions for nonprofit organizations selling things but not buying things. It varies by the state a lot. And the biggest thing that you can come away from this slide with is, if you do not know how sales tax works with nonprofit organizations, you need to figure that out if you're selling something, because ignoring it is probably a bad idea. The good news is, if you want to know whether or not you need to get sales tax, Parent Booster USA has some resources on that on our website, parentbooster.org, or you can just send us an email into a Parent Booster. We know the state rules. We can tell you what you need to do with sales tax in your state. But to speak generally about an issue that is different in every single state in this country, generally speaking, if you sell something, you probably need to collect sales tax on it. There are very few states that have a blanket no effort exemption on the sale of goods for sales tax. There are a great many states that then have a form that lets you apply for sales tax exemption on the goods you sell. But if you don't file that form, then you are expected to be collecting and withholding and collecting and remitting sales tax. Some states, like Texas, which I know Booster Hub is a big fan of, have tax-free holidays where they say nonprofit organizations, school booster clubs can sell things 2 days out of the year and not collect sales tax, but all other times you must collect sales tax. Texas also has a number of different niche exemptions for certain goods sold by booster clubs. If there's one thing you can take away from this slide, it's that it's a mess. And I'm not going to be able to tell you what your rules are off the top of my head. But what I can say is, if you do not know what your state sales tax rules are, you need to find that out before you sell anything. And your 501c3 exempt status is not going to automatically get you sales tax exemption in most states. I know, very helpful. It's becoming more of an issue because states realize how much money that they are losing to the failure to collect sales tax. And so they are starting to look at it more closely. Again, this varies by the state greatly. So honestly, you're going to need to look this up.
Got it. Perfect. One thing that I've found is that a lot of booster clubs are now selling more things, tangible items versus like just donations for sponsorships. And they're doing that online very differently than it was done 5 years ago, just a short while ago. And I think that has put a lot of people into this sales tax issue without knowing it. That once you move to selling goods online and you're not just accepting some donations, then you've moved into a organization that has to consider collecting and remitting sales tax. So we see that a lot with our clubs.
Though one great solution to that is if you want to have an online storefront and sell things online, there are a variety of organizations out there who will basically run that storefront for you, host it. They'll take a bit of commission off of it, but they'll handle the payment processing and they'll handle the sales tax, which is really convenient.
Exactly. So absolutely. So definitely some great points there. And then if you do have specific sales tax questions, please reach out to Parent Booster. They're a great resource to get those questions answered. And I do see some questions coming in, and so we will answer those at the end of the session here as we move through. And we'll move on to the next topic here. So we're going to talk about financial controls, why you need them, where fraud can occur, and some best practices. In regards to financial controls, somewhere in the amount of about $2 million in the last 3 years has been stolen from booster clubs and school support organizations, and that's what was actually caught and measured, which doesn't count the amounts that went through and nobody ever caught them. So there is a tremendous amount of fraud and theft in our school support organizations. And while we want to trust all of our fellow parents and members, just the other day someone told me that one of their board members had been taking money from their organization, and they were just starting to start over and recover from that. So it does happen fairly often. We like to believe that we're working with the best of people, but it is very smart from a fiduciary role in your booster club to make sure that you're protecting against these things happening. So where we see the fraud, and we'll start with you need the protections to protect against fraud and theft. And the best ways to do that are to follow some best practices and documentation, things that we'll talk about. So you want to make sure that anytime money is moving in any direction from any way within your booster club, that you have ways to see that and ways that are documented. So a lot of the places where we see that fraud can occur is in the approval role. So that's a big portion of the fraud and theft comes out of the officer role, particularly the treasurer role in a booster club, because they're the ones handling the money. So a lot of times we see things like checks have been written with one signer, money's been moved out of accounts. One of the things that I see here all the time that drives me crazy is simple things like if you're using a payment system such as Square and you're using the same login and password that 3 or 4 boards ago were using, you're at risk for somebody going in and changing the bank account to where all that money gets deposited to. So just some things you want to think about in terms of your logins, your documentation, who has access, and who has control. In Booster Hub, one of the things that our system does is it puts all of your transactions and all of your accounting online, and then your entire Booster Club board can have read-only access to that. So they can't go in and edit or change it, but they can see the numbers, and they can see the last time the reconciles were done, and they can see where the money's been moved. And it's just a great practice to have extra set of eyes on those financial movements to make sure that everything's matching and it's doing what it's supposed to do. The other place where we see that fraud can occur is where non-controls exist. Probably to me, the biggest place for risk of fraud is accepting cash in a concession stand setting. If you're not tracking inventory or you're not tracking what you've sold, and you don't have a specific structure for how to set up your cash drawers, this is really easy for people to take money from your club. I know that at one point in our booster club, we had a big tournament. It was a Friday night. I walked out of our concession stand with about $5,300 in cash in my pocket. And what concerned me was no one knew I had that money except for me and the other person that had signed off on the cash sheet. And the person that had signed off on the cash sheet didn't have any access to the subsequent information like bank statements or things where they could have seen that deposit come through. So it's really important to make sure that you have multiple people. Typically when you're counting money, you want to have 2 people. That when you're reconciling your bank statements, that you have at least 2 people that are involved in that process, specifically one that is not a signer on your bank account, so that they can be seeing what money is coming and going. In Booster Hub, we have an automated cash counting tool, cash tally sheet that you complete at the end of an event, and that calculates the money that you should have in the drawer and whether or not you're over or under. It also digitally records that in the system, so your treasurer and your president can see it, as well as your members can see it, so they know that that money is supposed to be there. So again, you want to try to put controls in place to know when and where and how the money moved. Think about those logins that have been sitting out there for a long time and all those types of things. When we talk about best practices, budget, again, it's a great place to start. It's going to give you a really good way to see if something is way off or way under or way over. If you don't have a budget, you're not going to know that. And I just see so many clubs that just don't use a budget at all. And so that's just really important to kind of have some idea of what type of numbers you should be seeing. And then on the approval process and the documentation, if you're going to have expenses approved, there should be a process for that, a check request form or some sort of approval that has documentation. It gets signed, it gets passed along, and then most importantly, a place to store those check requests so that they can be used later on to go back and audit the figures. In Booster Hub, we have an automated check request. It's all done in the system. You can attach your invoices and receipts. So there should be, for every expense transaction, there should be a request to tie to it. And again, it makes sure that nothing's getting spent that hasn't been approved. And then finally, checks and balances. This is just so important. you need someone besides the treasurer looking at your bank statements. You need someone besides the treasurer doing your reconciles, doing your auditing at the end of the year to make sure that the figures match what they're supposed to match. So you definitely want to create various points where you can balance things against each other to make sure that you're not missing any money in that process. And another great one, I think I already mentioned it, is if you are like running a concession stand, keeping some type of inventory. At our concession stand, the players come and take a water and that kind of thing. So we always allow for the numbers to be a little bit off. But generally speaking, what you purchased, you should have sold or you donated by the end of the year. And if you're way off, you really need to look into what's happening in your club. And then one of the really best ways to eliminate the potential for fraud, particularly in the sales side, is to go cashless and to do all your transactions through a credit card system. It's much more difficult for people to have fraud in those systems because everything is documented and does have sort of central controls. And if you do that, as I mentioned, make sure you're updating your logins often so that people who are no longer members of your club don't have access to those financial accounts.
Yeah, in my experience, the biggest thing you can do is just make it difficult to steal money. For the most part, Booster Club fraud and embezzlement does not occur by hardened criminals who have this grand master plan. Usually it happens because it's a easy spur of the moment thing that a person's pretty sure they're not going to get caught doing. If you make it hard and or you make it so that it's pretty obvious that you're going to get caught pretty fast, you're going to cut down on your risk of embezzlement a great deal. And that really does come down to just having someone who can't spend money reviewing the money that has been spent, having two people involved in the collection and spending of money wherever possible, and generally just adopting good review practices to ensure that you know where all of the money is going. If someone knows that there's someone else that they have to convince to steal the money and that there's some third person that they're going to have to convince to not get caught when the books get looked at, that's too much work.
Yeah.
They're not going to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the theft and fraud that gets caught actually gets caught when the next board comes in. So like the next board comes in and is trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what happened, and then that's when they realize the money's missing. And then of course very little of it ever gets recovered. So we all worked so hard to raise all this money to support our kids. Adding some financial controls to protect it is really a smart idea. We'll jump into some tips and tricks, and Drew, feel free to jump in here. We'll kind of go through a couple of them first. An annual calendar. So I highly recommend that your booster club set up an annual calendar of events that happen every year. And this is really more on the fiduciary side of the board rather than the actual events. We spend a lot of time thinking about when we're going to do this fundraiser and this event, but really think about it from the organizational side. So when you should be doing your audit, when you should be filing your tax returns, checking on your 501c3 status. Drew, can you speak to this? A lot of organizations get their 501c3 status and then they forget to file a tax return, or the board changes over and they don't. What happens then?
Yes, so this is the Pension Protection Act. By statute, if you fail to file 3 consecutive 990s, the IRS will automatically revoke your tax-exempt status. The IRS doesn't have a choice in the matter. It's not appealable. You have to get it reinstated because if you miss 3 in a row, a computer just kicks you out.
Gotcha. So yeah, we see a lot of clubs that, the board switched over and one board thought the other board did it. And then we come in and say, well, when was your last tax return? And it was quite a few years ago. So definitely set that up, set it up on some sort of system so that it can roll over to a new board. We have that capability in Booster Hub to put it in your calendar and set it for your board members. But just things like, when you should be looking at your budget cycle, when you should be doing the audit, audit. Hey, let's do concession inventory in January of every year if you're a fall sport, see what you have left and kind of reconcile those numbers. But put together, sort of a fiduciary annual calendar, and that will really help you not miss some of these important things. And more importantly, when I'm ever talking about booster clubs, I'm always talking about handing it over to the next board. It's when you leave, because most of us, we're doing our best to do it right, but when the next person comes in, if they don't have anything to follow, it's just as hard for them to do it again. So if you can give them some tools to follow, that's really helpful. Online forums. So one of the things that I recommend is joining, a lot of the online communities that talk about some of the fundraising and legal sides of the booster clubs. There's a lot of great resources out there, and you can get a lot of information. And so what we find a lot with our booster clubs is the volunteers come in and they don't have a lot of training or they don't know a lot. But when you step into the role as an officer of a booster club, you've just accepted fiduciary responsibility for that corporation, and there's a little bit of legal bite to it. So you want to make sure that you have, some education on how to do that. And obviously, if you're watching this webinar, you've made a great step in the right direction. You're doing that already, but definitely check out some of the tools that are out there and available for you. Auditing is a great tool. We don't see enough clubs do it, but I highly recommend it to have somebody. I recommend somebody completely from outside of your booster club to come in and just audit your financials and your bank statements and to make sure that everything that looks like it should have happened did happen, and then document that. So you've got a point in time where the past 12 months has been looked at and everything has been in order, and then going forward you've got a good point to start from. And then tools. Both Booster Hub and ParentBoosterUSA offer a ton of tools to help manage all of these more organizational level things in your booster club. So as I mentioned in Booster Hub, we have a lot of automated systems. For example, on the budgeting, our budgeting system, when you approve the budget, it documents the budget in our file system, and it won't let you delete that budget. So it knows that that was an approved budget, and it really gives you a checks and balance on those budgets. And then when you create an amended budget, it saves that one as well. So you have a record of all of your budgets that you've amended and gone through the process of doing. And then also things like check request, cash tally sheets, inventory, all of those types of things. There's a lot of tools, whether you want them to be online like we have in Booster Hub, or you want to use paper tools like that. I know Parent Booster's got some good resources on those, a lot of templates that you can use. Drew, any thoughts on that?
We have templates for days. If you need a template, we've got a template. If we don't have a template, send us an email. We'll make you a template.
A lot of great forms over at Parent Booster. And then, we talked about the sales tax, and this is something to look into in your state, but I always like to point it out in Texas. So one of the rules in Texas is that if you sell merchandise, there are 2 days a year that you can deliver that merchandise and not have to collect sales tax on it. So that's a way that you can sell something perhaps pre-order or online and then deliver it all on the same day, and then you can kind of get around that sales tax issue if you utilize things like those 2 tax-free days. So when you dive into the sales tax requirements for your organization, you may want to look at some of those. Usually a lot of the states have tax-free days or things like that. Any other points, Drew, that you wanted to cover?
No, I think the big thing is reach out for help. You're not going to know all the answers. Attend a webinar, send an email. We'll get you sorted out.
Perfect. Well, we've got a bunch of questions up, so I'll start here. So from Jill, it says, how do you suggest tracking amended budgets? And some new tabs in spreadsheets or versions of documents. So we recommend, creating a shared drive of some sort that your booster club uses, ongoing, and then saving those amended budgets, as well as putting them with the meeting minutes, sending them out to your email list so that everybody's got a copy. As I mentioned in Booster Hub, we actually have a system that documents the time and date on the budget and stores it permanently so it can't be updated. But definitely want to have some way to carry that information forward. If you're not using any online tools, you'd want to document it in like a binder that a club uses and passes forward. Always a little trickier with that just because things can get ripped out, and that's why we made a software for it, to be quite honest.
Yeah, this is typically just a matter of versioning your budgets, having 2022 budget for V1, V2, V3. I know it takes up space and it's ugly, but there aren't very many better ways to do it. There are a lot of online softwares out there, and they'll all be able to do essentially that. But it ultimately does just come down to versioning the documents.
Absolutely. And then from Bill Drew, he asks, what does a booster club need to provide to a donor who asks for a receipt or confirmation of a donation?
Yeah, so we get this question all the time. If you want a fancy official looking template, we've got one on ParentBoosterUSA, parentbooster.org under our resources. But all it really needs to say when you get right down to it is, "Dear so-and-so, thank you for your generous donation of X to our booster club." And really all the donor needs for the donor, all they need for their records is the amount they donated and to whom. So that'll get you there. "Dear John Smith, thank you for your generous donation of $50 to the Drew Englund football boosters."
And does it need to reference whether or not any goods or services were provided?
If you're getting donations in kind, which is basically when you're getting a donation of a good or a service, it's, "Dear John Doe, thank you for your generous donation of a tractor to the Drew Englund Football Booster Club." You don't put the value of the tractor or the service or the good or whatever you're getting, because you don't necessarily know, and ultimately it's the donor's responsibility for reporting the value. You are going to need to figure out the value for your own personal return, but for the purposes of the donation letter, you just say, "Thank you so much for donating the tractor."
And if, for instance, the booster club were selling tickets to a fundraiser, and there was it's a dinner and you get dinner tickets, but there's also a donation included, would you handle that differently?
So that's the wonderful world of, so tax deductibility for donations requires that the donation not get equivalent value in return. And when you are getting something in return, you can only deduct the value of the donation that is in excess of the thing that you're getting back. So if the ticket at the dinner you're going to costs $50 and you get a $20 dinner, then about $30 of it is tax deductible. If you are feeling nice, you can explain that in the donation letter. Generally speaking, if you are just selling something and you're raising money through selling a thing, say the dinner, you would just give a receipt for the dinner invitation. So the Drew Englund Football Booster Club is having a banquet to raise money for uniforms. I'm charging $50 a head to attend the banquet. Somebody comes in and pays me $50. I'll give them a receipt. Here's your receipt that you paid us $50 to attend the banquet. If the donor then wants to go off and count that as a tax deductible donation, and they might ask you a question, well, how much does it cost the booster club to feed me for the banquet? At which point I would probably say about $20. I would not write them a donation receipt for $30. I would just give them the receipt and then answer their question. But I would be happy to answer that question in writing, and then they can put it on their tax return. And in the bizarre world where the IRS audits someone over a $50 tax deductible donation, then they have the receipt for the dinner and then the email from me saying that was worth about $20.
Got it. Perfect. We see that question a lot. People want to know how they need to do the receipts. The next question says, does sales tax apply to rummage sales, fundraisers, for instance, or reselling of goods?
Probably.
Okay.
Anytime you're selling any good, sales tax by default is going to apply unless there is some exception for it. Is there an exception for the rummage sales? Maybe. It depends on your state and what your state sales tax rules are and what your state exemption rules are. But by default, yes, it's going to apply.
Great. And then another question here from Jill on income tax, and I think this is more on which tax bracket you're kind of in for the nonprofit. How is the $50,000 cutoff defined? Does the income include donations? And I believe it's all revenue. Is that correct?
It is all revenue, all money you bring in, even if it's a pass through, even if it's just the football why am I stuck on football? Let's move on. Even if the drama teacher says, look, we're all going out to this theater to put on this performance. Each child needs to give the school a $20 participation fee. Booster Club, Drew Englund Drama Booster Club, would you be so kind as to get together with the parents and collect the $20 and then hand it over to the school? And so I say, absolutely, happy to help. I go out to the 30 parents, I collect $20. That's $600 towards that $50,000 cutoff, even if I'm just giving it to the school immediately. It's every single dollar that passed through my hands in the course of a year. For the purposes of the 990N and the 990N only, it's actually an average over 3 years. You can file the 990N if on average over the most recent 3 years, your gross receipts are under $50,001. All other forms, it's just a hard cutoff.
Yeah, that average over 3 years is nice. We missed that 1 year on our club. we filed anyways, and we didn't have to, so that was a lot of extra work. But next question is, when fundraising for a group trip, can you give us some information on how to credit individual student accounts with those funds?
You shouldn't. Getting into more details, individual student accounts are always going to be problematic because they are what's referred to as individual fundraising accounts, which is a form of cooperative fundraising. And the IRS says that cooperative fundraising is not a charitable activity, which means that you can't do it as a 501c3 organization. If you're a for-profit entity and you're paying income tax, you can do what you want. But if you are a charitable organization, then funds raised needs to benefit everyone as a whole. You can't just say Sally Sue raised $500, and so she gets $500 to the school trip. Billie Jean over here raised $20, and so they get $20 to the trip. You can't do that. You have to give equal support to all the students. You can't keep track of how much money a particular student fundraised and credit that amount specifically to them. A lot of people ask, why does the IRS have a problem with that? The answer is because at that point, you've just given them a part-time job. There's nothing wrong about part-time jobs, but the IRS want their tax money for it.
So let me throw you a curveball on that question, Drew. So in some groups, we see that if you volunteer or you work a certain event or something, then you get credit towards your fees or a discount on merchandise. Is that considered the same thing?
Yes, that is still a part-time job.
Got it. Okay, good feedback there. And then from Rocio, so if we do a candle sale through a company, we have to collect sales tax if it's done through a catalog and it has set prices.
It depends on if the candle company is setting their prices with sales tax included, and if they're then remitting the sales tax. I'd say most of them don't. Some of them actually do, though. So you should ask the question to whoever you spoke with to get this set up, because they're going to be able to tell you either way. But yeah, if the candle company isn't collecting sales tax, you probably do need to, assuming you're in a state where you need to collect sales tax. Again, this is very state specific.
Got it. Another question, does all fundraising, whether selling flowers or corporate sponsors, benefit the team as a whole, or is it just for those who contribute to the booster through booster donations?
It's got to be the team as the whole. You cannot require participation in fundraising or participation in the booster club for support. It's basically the way booster clubs are getting this 501c3 status are being a charitable organization. And charitable organizations can't require people to donate to the organization or to volunteer for the organization in order to be supported by the organization. Again, that is cooperative fundraising, becomes essentially a part-time job, and the IRS wants their tax. The example I always like to use is NPR, National Public Radio. Have never donated to NPR, listen to it in my car radio all the time. Everybody can listen to NPR. You don't have to donate money to NPR. They'd love your donation, but you can listen to them even if you don't. And so same thing with booster clubs. Booster clubs have to support everybody, whether they donate or not, whether they volunteer or not, whether they show up to the booster club meeting or not.
Got it. And the next question, similar, along the same lines, but do you have suggestions for what should happen with funds that students raise if they leave the club or graduate without having depleted their account? And this really goes back to the same thing.
Yep.
It really
shouldn't have an account, is the
Mhm.
answer to that question. Is they shouldn't have an account, dump it in the general fund.
Got it.
And then dump everybody else's into the general fund and support everybody equally, because nobody should have an account.
Then we have Jill said, do you have best practices with debit card purchases made against the Booster Club? And I can address this one. We suggest the debit cards be handled exactly like checks, except for sometimes the request comes in post-purchase, but that it has documentation, including invoices and receipts with it, and then an approver on it, so that they can see that the charge was actually approved. If you have repetitive charges, you could do that in one documentation that this charge has been approved for all 12 months, and that could also be set out in your budget.
Make sure you assign someone who does not have a debit card to watching the debit cards. If the same person who has a debit card job is to watch the debit card transactions, you just put the fox in front of the hen house.
Good point. Good point. And our system's a little different because we have the visibility to see everything by much more than just the one or two officers. So that makes it a little different. And then Anna says, how do you address the need for internal controls when the board is opposed to a parent or active member, not in a board position, but instead hire a CPA? I'm concerned the CPA will not know our district guidelines for internal controls and disbursement process set forth in our bylaws.
If it's an actual accredited CPA who is working out of a reputable accounting firm, they're going to be fine. They may or may not know district guidelines, but they are going to be entirely comfortable managing internal financial controls, auditing transactions, and reviewing booster club budgets. Now, if you don't like that, if you think that there would be a better way to do it, your main recourse as a non-board member is to vote for different board members who feel differently.
Absolutely. And then even address the bylaws if you are on the board and set up the controls there and how it should be done, lay out the process there. Another question, are the automated systems a type of software? Yes. Most of the automated systems that have the controls are part of various software systems. Again, Booster Hub, that's what we do. We provide the software and the infrastructure to automate a lot of these checks and balances and controls that we've been talking about this evening. Do you have example budgets with sub-budget categories? I don't have an example that I can show on the screen, but for example, if your organization, I would recommend you can have your main budget, and then if you have, for example, a big fundraiser that you do, you may want to have a sub-budget just for that fundraiser to break down the income and expenses for that. Additionally, as we talked about, time frame, so you could create your sub-budgets with monthly or quarterly to see if they're tracking with the main budget. And then in terms of budgets and budget categories, I like to keep them aligned with where they're going to have to end up going at the end of the year anyways, which is into a lot of the categories that the IRS sets, and then just creating a few specific subcategories that align with specific activities in the Booster Club. I think it just helps. And so, there's a lot of just general categories: donations, fundraising, merchandise. All of those things have specific lines in the 990s. So I kind of recommend a backwards approach. Start with where you're going to have to get to and work backwards, and that'll help you get your budget set up. We see a lot of budgets that have hundreds of line items in them and none of them are grouped together. So I think if you start from the end and work backwards, you'll make your budgeting process a little smoother. You also make your end of the year smoother.
Yeah. And Parent Booster USA has sample budget. It's free in our resources, parentbooster.org, along with a variety of information on how to put together a budget. We have DIY guides in all the 990s. So if you want to work backwards, we can tell you exactly what every single line item in the 990 is and how to account for that in a budget. Or if you just want a picture of a budget that tells you, here you go, we've got that for you.
Start that too. Yeah, and in Booster Hub, we have a default set of chart of accounts that align with the 990, but are also very Booster Hub specific, Booster Club specific. So they include things like concessions and things like that we see in a lot of booster clubs. How do you handle raffles? So raffles, I think, are regulated mostly by the state. You may or may not have to have a license, and then there may or may not be tax implications. So Drew, I'll kind of pass that back to you.
Yes, it depends on the state. Some states, so raffles are a form of gambling. So a lot of states have some kind of regulation on it. There are a lot of states to say booster clubs can have raffles. Booster clubs have always had raffles. Don't worry about it. Some states say, well, okay, booster clubs have always had raffles, but you need to be in existence for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Some states just say, no, raffles are gambling, don't do it. So it is going to be based on your state. Sometimes you'll need to get a license, sometimes you won't. Again, this is another thing where if you go to Parent Booster USA and send us an email, we will tell you what the rules for your state are. The big thing that I can say about all raffles is your prize should not be worth $5,000 or more. I know your prizes probably aren't worth $5,000, but if your prize is worth $5,000, you have to file a report to the IRS telling them who won it, along with a social security number. And if you don't do that, you can get in trouble. So keep your prizes smaller than $5,000.
It's a very good tip there.
Actually, sorry, I had a massive brain fault. $5,000 is a different thing. $600 is the cutoff.
600. Oh, wow. That's a big difference. That might impact a lot more of our clubs.
Yeah, no, that's an important correction. $600, not $5,000.
Okay. Yeah, that would impact a lot of fundraising there. Another question to clarify, if students fundraise towards their own individual band enrichment fees, this is not allowed. And I think this is where the band side of the school district and the booster clubs have kind of merged. We see this a lot in the bands, where the band fees are required, or there's an account that rolls over. So I think this is really specific to the bands and a lot of the music organizations. But how do you suggest that, Drew? Because originally I think the band fees sat on the school district side, but a lot of booster clubs have moved them into the booster club.
If students are soliciting donations for the booster club, they cannot be allocated to a specific student. If what you're talking about is that the school has some kind of fee to participate in the band and the booster club is just collecting the fees on behalf of the school, so the band says you have to pay $200 to participate, give it to your booster club, the parent hands over the $200 and that's just tracked on a per student basis, that's fine. What's going on there is the booster club is just providing a service to the school. They're helping collect the fee. But if what you're talking about is actually the student going out and fundraising, whether it's car wash, participating in some kind of volunteer opportunity, selling candles, what have you, you cannot track you cannot track the money that came in and attribute the results of the fundraising to the individual students based on how much the students fundraised.
So there's no, even if it's a mandatory fee, you shouldn't be applying anything to that fee.
There is no workaround to the IFA rule, no. If you're just collecting money on behalf of the school, yes, you can absolutely track who paid it for which kid. But if you're actually going out and fundraising, no, you can't work around the IFA rule.
Okay. Looks like we've got 2 more questions related to that. So now that we know individuals shouldn't have an account, will the booster club need to vote to apply a certain amount of the funds raised to each of the students to pay down a balance for the trip? So if they spread that across all students and reduce the fee from $600 to $400, that would be okay, correct?
Correct. And this is where a budget is a great idea. You get together at the beginning of the year, you say, you talk to the coach, you know that you're going to need to, that the students are going to have to pay, I don't know, $600 to participate in all of the activities for the year. And so the Booster Club says, well, $600 sounds a bit much, but we think we can raise enough money that we can pay $200 towards that fee for each student. So, you've got this total amount that you need to raise for the year. You try and raise it, and then you apply it to that fee equally. You've given each student essentially $200 towards their fee. But yes, that's whether you do that through the budget or just through a separate operation of the board. Yeah, the board votes on how they want to spend the money.
And then the last question was, can we track student funds for a trip that they fundraise as long as we issue a 1099 at the end of the year?
Oh, wow. Okay. I've never had anyone actually call my bluff about being a for-profit entity.
There's a curveball.
Yeah. So, gosh, you're 1099ing them. So you're just treating them like an independent contractor. If you are okay with the fact that that means the student is going to have to pay an income tax on the money that you raise, and are okay with the risks involved with potentially being treated like an employer if the state determines that these were not properly identified as independent contractors, but actually employees of the Booster Club, and are willing to report that employment on the 990 where applicable, yeah, sure.
Okay, so there's a possible
Yeah,
workaround.
if you're okay with the tax implications, yes, you can do that.
Got it. Perfect. It looks like we've got, oh wait, here's, are you saying IFA rule or different letters?
Yes. I as in Idaho, F as in Frank, A as in Apple. IFA, individual fundraising accounts. If you want to know about those, I have written extensively about them for Parent Booster USA. And so if you go to our website, parentbooster.org, under our resources, there is a lot there about IFAs, what they are, how they work, why there's a problem. We have links to all of the official IRS writing on the topic. We have links to the court case that essentially settled this law. We can get you everything you want to know about IFAs and more. ParentBooster.org.
Thank you, Drew. I know that's, again, we see that a lot in the music programs, working through those mandatory band fees and things like that. So if you all have any additional questions, you can always send them over to team at boosterhub.com or info@parentbooster.org. Drew or myself or someone from our teams will get back to you on these topics that we've talked about tonight. We really appreciate everyone taking time and joining. Again, you can learn more boosterhub.com or parentbooster.org on both of the organizations. And we will be posting the link to this webinar on our Facebook page tomorrow. So if you'd like to share it with any of your fellow board members or fellow members, you can do it from there. And we'd love to hear from you and hear what topics that you're interested in. We'll be preparing for October webinar over the next few weeks. So if you have any hot topics in your club, please send those over to us at team@boosterhub.com. And Drew, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us tonight. We always welcome the opportunity to work with you guys, and you bring so much knowledge in to help all these volunteers running these organizations.
I was muted. My pleasure. I always love doing this.
All right. Well, everyone have a great evening, and we'll see you next month.